This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you episode 52 of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, December 26, 1908. I'll elaborate on what was happening in Westford 114 years ago as we read. The first section in December 26th is titled The Electrics, referring to the electric trolley. There are those who try hard to believe that the town is playing a bunco game on the Lowell and Fitchburg Electric Railroad. Not to go back too far, let us see who has played the bunco game. The Lowell and Fitchburg agreed to build the main line through the center of the town, and there would be no spurs to discontinue. But the town let them off with the promise that they would do better for the town, go down the Groton Road and build two spur lines, one from Graniteville to Westford Center and one from the Groton Road to Brookside, both to connect with the main line. Then comes forward said company, saying they could not afford to build two spurs and operate them, and the town let them off with the promise that they would build a branch line to connect with the main line on the Groton Road and run by way of West Chelmsford and Brookside to Westford Center. Now comes forward said company and informs the town through the newspapers that they must be relieved of this agreement. Nor is this all that the town has relieved of legal obligation. The excise tax due the town from this company has never been enforced and has practically been thrown into the wastebasket. The lighting of the streets, another agreement, has also been keeping company with the excise tax in the wastebasket. We should be quite willing to leave it to anyone who has brains enough to be an inmate of a lunatic asylum to be judged as to who has the bunco on them, the town or the company. Now, I do not know for a certain who Equity is, who thus signs his name, but the tone of his communication in last week's newspaper leads me to believe that it is an official of the Lowell and Fitchburg Railroad who has personal investments in it. If it is the new superintendent, we have only met him once at the farm playground yard, corner of Stony Brook and Lowell Roads. That's where Samuel Taylor lived, the author of this piece. And if ever we thought we were facing a gentleman of courtesy and honesty, this was one of the occasions. Nor have we changed our opinion from anything said, done, or written since. But this is not a question of personalities, but of financial debility and the proper tonic to apply. Equity charges me with not being relevant. Now perhaps I can better retort than refute by charging up his statements, part of them at least, by the measuring intelligence at this end of affairs as, quote, not knowing what he is writing about, end quote. The real question before the public and the Lowell and Fitchburg is the running expenses of the road. Equity charges the people of Westford with keeping quiet until after the main line was built and then coming forward and demanding a line to the center of the town. This statement is most emphatically contrary to the facts. There is but one franchise from Groton Line to Westford Center, one date of granting it, the same hearings at Town Hall open to all the public from the North Pole to the tropics, and the people of Westford have not been lying in ambush until the line was built from Ayer to North Chelmsford, and then demanding an independent line to Westford for their own selfish use when their automobiles are not serviceable, of which there are only 4. But as bearing upon the running expenses of the road, Equity, the anonymous author of the previous week's article, says that 2 courses are open: make a raise in fares or discontinue from Westford to Brookside, and that the former would be an injustice to the mill hands in the valley to help out the rich autoists and others at Westford. I'm willing to leave it to the reading and traveling public as to which is the greater injustice, a raise in fares to all, or a discontinuance of car service to a portion of the community who live on the line of this franchise. The amount of travel is not increased any by, to some extent, inferior equipment and inexperienced help. When a fuse blows out and the passengers are left in the woods to become motors themselves, and the motorman admits he doesn't know what to do, when passengers arrive at Brookside and change cars for Westford and find that that trip is to be cut out, and that too without being notified by the conductor, when passengers at Westford wait in the cold for the early morning car to connect at Brookside for Boston, and find too often that it is like the Irishman, quote, just soon enough to be too late, end quote, then these things are a friction against the prosperity of the road. That the company are doing the best they can is probably true, and the reason why they can't render better service is because they are anchored to that original and extravagant debt, which after all this fuss of feathers comes right back to roost on the running expenses, even if the roosting place isn't relevant. Obviously, that's an opinion of Samuel Fletcher with regard to the wish of the Lowell and Fitchburg Street Railway to cease the branch line that ran from Brookside up to Westford Center. The next section is the About Town section. An important book will soon be published under the direction of Mrs. George T. Day, that's Cornelia Augusta Fletcher Day, who has for several years been collecting names and dates of former teachers and scholars of Westford Academy from its incorporating up to and including the centennial year. They might have also mentioned trustees of Westford Academy. This is a grand and necessary work, as showing the influence of this ancient corporation gathered for purposes of equipping life with the influence of the whole man and not the limited and partial. This publication will reveal the far-reaching influence of lives that were kindled into a flame at Westford Academy, besides opening up a vast labyrinth of forgotten memories, anecdotes, reminiscences, and history. This booklet is titled A General Catalog of Trustees, Teachers, and Students, Westford Academy, published in Westford, Mass. In Westford in 1912, so about 4 years after this was written. The book is available at both the Westford Museum and at the JV Library. The museum may actually have some old ones available for sale. The annual meeting of the Board of Trustees of Westford Academy was held Saturday, December 12th at the residence of the Honorable Charles S. Hamlin in Boston. The following trustees were present: Honorable John D. Long of Hingham, the Honorable Charles S. Hamlin of Boston, J. Henry Fletcher of Belmont, Henry M. Wright of Quincy, George T. Day, Reverend Benjamin H. Bailey, Abiel J. Abbott, the Honorable Herbert E. Fletcher, Walter C. Wright, Charles O. Prescott, John C. Abbott, Captain S. H. Fletcher of Westford. At the business meeting, the following officers were elected: George T. Day, President, the Honorable H. E. Fletcher, Vice President, Captain S. H. Fletcher, Secretary, A. J. Abbott, Treasurer, George T. Day, Auditor, George T. Day, Captain S. H. Fletcher, J. C. Abbott, Standing Committee, Reverend Edward A. Horton, A. J. Abbott, J. A. Cameron, Committee on Teachers, A. J. Abbott, J. Adams Bartlett, J. H. Fletcher, the Honorable Charles S. Hamlin, Committee on Loans and Finances. I noticed when I was preparing today's podcast that this booklet also contains a listing of Westford Academy trustees, and several of the men just mentioned here as being trustees are not included in that list, so I presume there's others that are missing also. The Treasurer's Report shows expenditures of $3,103.83 received from the town, $2,200 for high school purposes, leaving a balance of $903.82 that the Academy pays towards supporting the school. By this arrangement and the and the showing of this report, those who wish may see that the town is saving practically an even $1,000 a year in maintaining a high school, and yet some want to have the town put its hands in its trousers pocket and fumble around among that other $25,000 that is borrowed for school building purposes and find $1,000 a year to support an independent school. When we all get to that point of docility, to say nothing about imbecility, that we love to be taxed for the sake of being taxed and get nothing for it, then we shall all vote for this scheme. So at this time, the Westford Academy was an independent school, and the town paid a little bit to the academy for Westford students to attend the academy as their high school. But about, sometime in the late 1920s, I believe, the town actually took over Westford Academy as the town-run high school and not as a private school. The next section is the Westford Center section. The Women's Alliance of the Unitarian Church held an interesting and well-attended meeting at the home of Mrs. George T. Day last week, Thursday. The 300th anniversary of the birth of John Milton was the theme of the afternoon. Mrs. Benjamin H. Bailey, president of the Alliance, read a paper on his life, and Mr. Bailey, or Reverend Bailey, read extracts from his writings. Mrs. Nellie E. Karkin has been sick and under the doctor's care this week with an attack of grip, what we call influenza. George E. Gould recently sold at auction what is known as the True A. Bean Cottage. The purchaser was Horace Gould, and the price paid $600. Mrs. Lucy B. Radin, the former popular teacher at Minot's Corner, has been visiting Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Knight, at whose home she boarded during her stay in town. Helpful, appropriate, and inspiring were the Christmas services at the Congregational Church last Sunday. The auditorium had been trimmed simply and effectively with evergreen. Mr. Marshall preached an excellent sermon to a large and attentive congregation, and a full choir rendered good music. Sermon, anthems, responses, prayer, and all centered about the joy to the world of the birth of the Christ. In the evening, Mr. Marshall conducted the meeting. Subject was the King Born. Of course, the Congregational Church is the building on Lincoln Street that we now know as the CPA. With his characteristic helpfulness, Mr. Marshall and with Mrs. Marshall, in the midst of a busy week, went down to the East Village and conducted another pleasant neighborhood sing Tuesday evening. Gospel hymns and other music was enjoyed, with pleasant sociability and the strengthening of the bonds of church fellowship. I believe the East Village was the area around the intersection of Chamberlain Road and Main Street. The schools closed last Friday for 2 weeks vacation. On the last afternoon, appropriate Christmas exercises were carried out in the several rooms. Miss Edith Bicknell from South Royalston, Edith A. Wright from Ayer, Edna Ferguson from South Dartmouth, and Stella Hartford from Hempstead, New Hampshire, are enjoying the Christmas vacation at home from their teaching in these towns. Those were all young ladies who probably all graduated from Westford Academy and were now teachers. The next section is the Grange section. Down on the program for the last meeting of the old year in Grange was a Christmas entertainment, but owing to the fact that it has departed from its usual custom of only taking in candidates at the April and October meetings and admitted this fall a second class of 9 candidates, Thursday evening of last week they were initiated in the 3rd and 4th degrees. The 3rd degree was conferred by the ladies' degree staff in full form, and the 4th degree by the regular officers. A pretty bit of ceremony during the evening, which was a surprise to most of those present, was the presentation of a few well-chosen words by Mrs. Lillian Lumbert, Flora of the ladies' staff. Florida is a Grange title. Two handsome bouquets, one to W.M. Wright, who has done such faithful work as director, and one to Mrs. Edson G. Boynton for her constant and capable services as pianist. The next section is called Club. The regular meeting of the Tadmont Club took place in Library Hall Tuesday afternoon. Mrs. Ellen H. Richards, who is so well and favorably known here from her former association with our town and for her splendid work in household economics, was the speaker of the afternoon. It was a much to be regretted circumstance that anything so excellent and helpful as the afternoon address should have been placed during Christmas week, when the average woman is so busy. However, quite a good audience assembled to hear Mrs. Richards, whose subject was, quote, the chemistry of food, end quote. And she naively confessed that this was a favorite one and gave a sensible, practical talk on this truly vital subject based upon long experience and study. She deplored the comparative indifference of many housewives in this matter and inclined to the belief that the increased cost of living was not so much in essentials as in an acquired taste for many things considered necessary. She touched upon various food theories, such as vegetarianism, Fletcherism, etc., and then proceeded with some definite actual facts to outline a well-balanced dietary based upon chemical knowledge and the essential part it played in everybody's life. Mrs. Richards recommended a few excellent books on the subject, and at the close of her lecture, questions were asked before the meeting adjourned. A rising vote of thanks was given Mrs. Richards. Fletcherism, mentioned in this paragraph, was a food fad of the Victorian era inspired by Horace Fletcher, who was born in 1849 and died in 1919, who argued that food and even liquids must be chewed 32 times before being swallowed. Quote, nature will castigate those who don't masticate, he said, for which he was dubbed the Great Masticator. The next section is the Graniteville section. Cameron Circle, CF of A, Companions of the Foresters of America, held a largely attended meeting in their rooms Tuesday evening. The following officers were elected for the ensuing year: Chief Companion, Mrs. Bridget Healy; Sub-Chief, Miss Dora Leduc; Treasurer, Mrs. Julia B. Wall; Financial Secretary, Mrs. Hannah E. Harrington; Recording Secretary, Lena J. Healy; Right Guide, Miss Mary J. Sullivan; Left Guide, Flora Stewart; Inside Guard, Engla Matson; Outside Guard, Teresa Marchione; Trustee, Annie Healy; Physician, Dr. W. H. Sherman. All the teachers in the different rooms of the Sergeant School held some form of entertainment for the pupils last week, Friday afternoon, before the Christmas vacation. A pleasing program was successfully carried out, and each pupil received some pretty gift. Annual Christmas tree exercises were given by the Sunday school children of the Methodist Episcopal Church on Thursday evening at 7:30 o'clock. The exercises and tree, as usual, were in the main part of the church. The Christmas exercises and tree for the children of St. Catherine's Sunday School were held on Wednesday evening at 7:15. The Methodist Episcopal Church in Graniteville is the same church we know as the United Methodist Church of Graniteville. The mills of the Abbott Worsted Company will close on this Friday and Saturday, enabling the employees to enjoy a 3 days vacation. The next section is the Forge Village section. Mrs. Ellen McDonald, wife of Joseph McDonald of this village, passed away Wednesday morning after a lingering illness. Everything possible was done for her, hoping that she might be well again. She wished to live for her home and children, but it was not to be. She even superintended the Christmas tree arrangements and hoped to be with her little ones in their enjoyment of their Christmas festivities, but she was called to the home prepared above, where her mother and 2 brothers who went before a few years ago were awaiting her. The usual Christmas tree exercises took place in Cameron School last week, Friday afternoon, and were enjoyed by relatives of the pupils. That's the news in Westford for the week ending December 26, 1908. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Nick Woodbury of WestfordCAT for providing technical support. You can find transcriptions and podcasts from the Wardsman at our website at museum.westfordcat.org. www.westford.org, or visit the Historical Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from a century ago. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you will join us for next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.